always choose to talk.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world for
Is that going to
Stavovi Williama Engela se lako ispisuju na papir, ali se sa manje lakoće usvajaju. Iako obožavan od strane globalne čitalačke publike, ovaj novinar, ekonomista i publicista nije uvek onim što ima da kaže imao isti efekat i na one o kojima je pisao. A ta lista je duga. Njegovi najpoznatiji stavovi, na kojima je pored ostalog izgradio karijeru, uključuju i onaj da je arapsko proleće orkestrirao Pentagon. Tvrdi da nafta nema biološko, već geološko poreklo. Prema njemu, globalno zagrevanje izmišljotina moćnih. Plan Sjedinjenih država je da prisvoje resurse Afrike i Bliskog istoka kako bi zaustavili rast Rusije i Kine. Čak i Hrvatska prema Engelu treba da zahvali Sjedinjenim državama na ulaznici za Evropu, jer njihovim pristupanjem žele da spreče ruski Gazprom da preko gasovoda izađe na Jadransko more. Ovaj rođeni Teksašanin diplomu inženjera dobio je na prestižnom Princetonu, a diplomu komparativne ekonomije na Štokholmskom univerzitetu. Svojim domom smatra Nemačku poslednjih 25 godina. Doselio se u Wiesbaden iz Njujorka, koje je prema sopstvenom priznanju 80-ih bio nemoguće mesto za život. Iako još uvek ima američki pasoš, kaže pomirio se s tim da se Amerika nalazi na Titaniku. A kada je reč o njegovoj novousvojenoj domovini, smatra da još uvek nije kasno da se osvesti i potraži druge saveznike u svetu, koji nisu Sjedinjene države.
Mr. Engel, welcome to Al Jazeera. In one of your books, Gods of Money, you're asking one, if I may so, a very crucial questions. Who are the gods of money? And you're quite combat towards the whole financial system. So I'm thinking, are you being too harsh, or are you just presenting the right type of medicine?
Well, I think you have to be harsh against this present financial system because it's simply out of control. What you had after World War II, Wall Street replaced the City of London as the capital of world banking and finance. What I'm talking about is perhaps 20, 25 mega banks in the world, not more, and the power that they have, banks with balance sheets, I'm talking Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, some of those banks have balance sheets that are larger than the gross domestic product of entire nations, most entire nations of the world. And that is a power in private hands, and the power to create money out of the blue that is simply disproportionate to any kind of rational economic life in the world. So that plus the unregulated over-the-counter derivatives trade that 6 or 8 of those banks control worldwide create literally a financial Molotov cocktail that has exploded already 2 times in the last several years. What I'm talking about are these mega banks, international banks that have created a myth that they're too big to fail. In my view, they're too big to save.
You said that the modern bankers perceive themselves as a sort of modern gods. We know that in Greek mythology, modern gods or any sort of gods get away with a lot of stuff. How is it possible that bankers can do the same thing, especially after everything we witnessed in the last 4 years?
Rome was not destroyed by foreign invaders in the 3rd and 4th century. It was destroyed by rot from within. And that literally is what's destroying what used to be one of the most vibrant economies in the world when I was a young boy growing up in the United States. The US today is a bankrupt, hollowed out, former industrial economy which has outsourced most of their creative industry to Asia or to parts of Europe or Eurasia, and is living off of coupon clipping from the rest of the world, the financial returns. And you have the government choking in debt, but not debt to rebuild the economy, the infrastructure, the roadways, the waterways across America that are urgently in dire need of repair. They're using the money to bail out these 6 mega banks, and those banks literally see themselves as the gods of money. Not one of the bankers responsible for this crisis in Wall Street has gone to prison. Not one has, scarcely one has even lost his job. It's so powerful. They buy Congress, they buy presidents. When you deregulate finance. Paul Volcker said this about a year ago. He said there's only one innovation in the last 30 years in modern banking that I think has brought something positive, and that's the invention of the automatic teller machine. Nothing else has been positive.
When Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State in the 70s, he was famously quoted as saying, if you control oil, you control all states. If you control the food, you control the people. And if you control the money, you control the whole world. Given what you've been doing for the last 30 years, actively writing, publishing, speaking on this matter, do you think that anything significantly changed in that time in between, and if anything changed at all?
The oil has been a major lever of control of nations since, well before World War I even, but certainly in the post-1945 world. The control of food, if you go to genetic manipulation, the development of agribusiness out of Harvard Business School in the 1950s, and then spreading that globally so that 20 or 30 mega corporations, all of them closely connected to the US government or Department of Agriculture and various other agencies, they dominate literally the food chain of Europe, of the United States, and now increasingly of large nations in Asia like China. So, but the pinnacle of this is a system where globally there is no national sovereignty over money creation left. And to my mind, the securitization project that was launched by Wall Street, asset securitization, real estate loans, car loans, student loans even, that was designed to create an illusion of risk-free investment and to spread those synthetic bonds that were created, mortgage-backed bonds among them, worldwide, so that more and more of the world would enter into this surrealist fantasy world of modern banking that Wall Street had developed. And when the bubble popped, everybody looked around and found that the billions of dollars of bonds that they thought they held as AAA bonds were built on a house of cards. It was a Ponzi scheme. It was a pyramid scam of the greatest dimension in world history. Trillions and tens of trillions of dollars of worthless paper. And now nobody even knows who the ultimate owner of that little house in Prescott, Arizona is, whose mortgage is tied to some Wall Street bank that sold it to a Korean investment fund. So it's just insanity writ large.
Let me quote you on one thing. You said the ultimate goal of the US is to take the resources of Africa and Middle East under military control to block the economic growth of China and Russia. Do you truly believe that, as you said, that US would like to take the control of the whole Eurasia?
If you look at the history of United States foreign policy, especially military policy, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, you reach the inescapable conclusion that for Washington, for the Pentagon, the Cold War never ended. The Pentagon budget today is larger than the combined defense spending of the other next 42 nations added up. It's colossally huge. And you have to ask, is there so much danger of world-threatening wars in the world that the Pentagon needs to be the policeman of the entire world? Or does that Pentagon budget actually create instabilities in parts of Africa and serve to foster certain interests to control those raw materials? Because I always in my work go back to the concept of geopolitics. And by geopolitics, you have to look at what the geology is, what the geography is of a land or groups of land or continents. And in this case, the mineral resources, the wealth of Africa, the oil, the metals and so forth, are perhaps the richest untapped resources on the face of the earth. No accident when the Chinese began a huge diplomatic charm offensive in Africa in 2006, 2007, showing more attention to African countries' needs than any British or American or European colonial regime has shown in the last 150 years. Suddenly, the Bush administration decides it's time to create something called the Africa Command of the Pentagon that strictly is focused on controlling Africa. And it's no accident that shortly after the AFRICOM is up and running, we have a series of NATO-led regime changes in places like Libya, and now it looks like they're about to try that same strategy in Syria.
You're one of the scholars who believe that the Arab Spring was part of the plan. Why?
Well, because I have the documentary evidence that the Arab Spring was planned by the U.S. State Department and agencies of the U.S. intelligence communities. The actual plan goes back to the early days of the Bush administration, Bush Jr., in 2003, 2004, just after the occupation of Iraq. They proposed at the G7 meeting in 2004 something called the Greater Middle East Project. And the Greater Middle East Project, which was rejected at that time by the other G7 countries as being far too dangerous, called for a series of regime changes across the Islamic world, going from Afghanistan down through the Arab Middle East oil countries and across northern Africa down to Morocco, if you will, kind of an arc or a crescent sweeping across the Islamic world. And they pitched it as creating the kind of financial revolution that the IMF created in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the shock therapy in Poland and so forth, introducing the so-called free market. But free market, of course, at a cost, because if you destabilize regimes in these countries, then you bring in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the conditionalities, and then always it's the same: devalue your currency, let foreign investors come in and buy your prized assets. And that's been a long-term goal of some people in Washington and in Wall Street, is to get their hands on these enormous state resources in these countries, in the Middle East and Northern Africa. It seems that they've largely succeeded in Libya.
Is the current situation in the Eurozone more of a political issue or economic issue?
It's both, but in essence, it started as a political problem. And it started as a problem precisely at the time the government of China and the Central Bank of China were openly telling the United States, we are very, very unhappy with the unrestrained deficit spending of the US government to bail out the banks, because that is threatening the value of more than $1 trillion of Chinese central bank investment in US government debt. Flooding the market with new debt is going to cheapen the value of the old debt. So precisely at that time, lo and behold, it's discovered that Greece has been fixing the books, so to speak, on its public debt in order to qualify in 2002 to enter the euro. And what's interesting about that is it turns out that the book fixer that helped the Greek government was none other than Goldman Sachs, one of the most powerful banks in the world, if not the most powerful today, and one of the most political banks in the world. And Goldman Sachs convinced the Greek government, the former Greek government, that they could hide the debt through exotic financial derivatives and other tricks that they showed them how to do. And they did it and got into the Eurozone. And then there was just a huge bonanza because of the low interest rates on entry of the euro at that point. And now, who knows where the bones are buried? Wall Street. The US Treasury, the US rating agencies, which are political entities, the three top rating agencies in the world, especially S&P and Moody's, if you examine how they've reacted to different major financial crises, the Asia crisis in 1997-98, and so forth, you'll see that their timing was such, when it came to the interests of major Wall Street banks, they were the last ones to react with a warning or a downgrade. But when it comes to a potential rival, the euro, to replace the dollar as reserve currency in 2009, 2010, they're preemptive. They're too quick to act. And the timing of their rating downgrades on the Greek question came just on the same day that the governments of the Eurozone and the European Union agreed in principle on a rescue package for Greece. So the opposite should have happened. But Standard & Poor's at that point in March of 2010 downgraded by 3 notches the sovereign debt of Greece, which made it junk bond debt, and that forced pension funds around the world to offload that debt overnight and created a huge financial crisis out of what had been a manageable crisis up to that time. So it's really what we're watching is kind of a, not Star Wars, but currency wars, if you will, between the euro and the dollar, because the only immediate candidate that could have replaced the dollar over the next 10 years as a reserve currency for world trade is the euro, because you have an industrial base, you have a trading economy, if you combine the Eurozone economies, that is world class, and you have the basis of a sophisticated banking system that could do that. So by attacking Greece, a tiny little part of the Eurozone, you attack the Achilles heel, no pun intended, you attack the Achilles heel of the Eurozone because it did have fundamental flaws. So it's a combination of both. Once you set that chain of reactions off, it's very difficult to control it.
How do you see alignment between Merkel and Sarkozy at this point and the fact that Cameron was pretty much brushed aside?
Well, I think the true state of the British banking system is far more serious than that, even of the Greek banking system, but certainly of the French or any of the other Italian and the other European banks. But that's been not talked about. So the financial markets are focusing where the sharks can make a killing and draw blood, and that's the Eurozone, because the press has built up so much momentum on this. But I think Sarkozy and Merkel have come together in a shotgun wedding, if you will, Germany and France, because the alternative is just inconceivable. That is a catastrophic breakup of the euro. The French had their own agenda. Sarkozy tried to the bitter end to push that through. The Germans, understandably, refused to be the checkbook for profligate countries in Europe like Greece, perhaps Portugal, although I don't think Portugal is anywhere near as serious as Greece.
According to your views, WikiLeaks is in part the CIA, Mossad, and Pentagon operation. So I was just wondering, in terms of how easily today is to create some sort of a conspiracy theory, would you think you're slightly going towards that line of conspiracy theory, or you think there's some merit into it?
This is a classic intelligence format. You leak hundreds of thousands of pages of worthless routine cables, and then within that you have certain, as he called it, spiked intelligence, really hot, damaging stuff. And that is a perfect ground for intelligence services. By this time, I think many more intelligence services are probably playing the game. Perhaps the Russians, perhaps the Chinese, I don't know. But when you create an aura that WikiLeaks is leaking authentic documents, it's very easy for a CIA or a Mossad or someone to insert a document in the right format and say this came from WikiLeaks. Up until now, it's operated to the advantage of the United States. Certain cables that were leaked on Tunisia led to the regime change that kicked off the entire Arab Spring, which was a Pentagon US State Department project and has been for years in preparation. So, if you examine in detail, the other rather curious thing about Julian Assange is that he supposedly got these 200,000 pages of State Department cables from a 22-year-old US Army private who was sitting down in Baghdad in a secure intelligence installation, downloading these files over a period of 18 months onto disks on his computer, undetected. And I've talked with computer experts who have computer knowledge with Pentagon security and so forth, and they said by the time he had downloaded 1 byte of secure intelligence from those sources, he would have been put in prison by the military police. You can't sit there for 18 months doing this. military security is not that lax in the Pentagon, excuse me.
You claim that one of the reasons why Croatia was giving a free pass, so to speak, to the European Union is thanks to United States. And according to your views, that mostly has to do with still sort of a war going on between the United States and the Russia. And I'm talking that in context of Gazprom's ambition to create a pipeline that will allow them to come to the Adriatic Sea. What's your take on that?
Nabucco was and remains a pet project of Washington. It's uneconomical, it makes no sense. Russia has an alliance strategy based on economic links to Western Europe. And if I were Vladimir Putin or Medvedev, I would probably use the resources I had to do much the same. So that Europe realizes that they have an economic link to Russia and that it's not Russia also has a dependency on Europe. So it's a complementary thing that is the opposite of antagonistic. And there's been if you will, kind of a hidden pipeline warfare going on between Washington and Moscow over the past, well, even since 1991, but certainly over the past 5 or 6 years. So as negotiations between Croatia's joining the South Stream or various adjuncts of that in the pipeline strategy of Gazprom, that I think has led to a certain realization in Washington they really had to put the pressure on Brussels, despite the financial crisis in Europe, to admit a new member, namely Croatia.
We're witnesses of a strong wave of criticism towards the Russian President Vladimir Putin, especially in terms of what's been described as a lack of democracy in Russia and abuse of power. Is there any stronger motive in your opinion?
Well, for Hillary Clinton to be protesting against the lack of democracy in another country is like the pot calling the kettle black, excuse me. So democracy is a pretty word, but who is talking about democracy? Let he who's without fault cast the first stone, Hillary. So there is another agenda here, and the other agenda, I think, is quite simple. This is being fostered in the same way the U.S. fostered the Orange Revolution with Ukraine in 2003, 2004, to create a pro-NATO regime change, or Saakashvili in Georgia, and to surround, essentially to surround Russia with hostile NATO member countries directly on its doorstep. So the prospect of Putin coming back with a tough realpolitik agenda to confront the United States on the threat of its missile defense screen that it's continuing to build around Russia, I think is something that Washington doesn't want. I think the future of the Balkans depends on decisions that will be made in Berlin, in Paris, in Rome, in key parts of Western Europe, of the European Union, about the future of Europe as a whole. And right now, I see the European elites, the power makers, the people behind the scenes who really tell the people at Davos, what the next big thing is going to be or not. I think they have a schizophrenia, and they've had this for some years. The schizophrenia is quite simple. It's on the one side, since 1945, they have been dependent on an Atlantic alliance with the United States for their very survival, as they see it. And that was very convenient for the United States. That wasn't charity. Don't get a romantic view of what the Atlantic alliance and the creation of NATO was all about. That allowed America to become the dominant economic power, political and military power in the post-war period. Now that American pillar of power is crumbling. I, as an American who grew up in the United States, see that as a tragedy of untold dimension. There's nothing I can do to stop that crumbling. I've written about the causes of that potential crumbling more than 37 years. But at this point, the Europeans are faced with a decision to go down with a sinking Titanic called the United States and its power projection, and go down with it, or explore new avenues, new bridges of cooperation with the oil-rich Middle East countries, with Africa, with Asia, and especially Eurasia. Brzezinski, in his famous 1997 book, The Grand Chess Game, pointed out the geopolitical reality is the only constellation on the face of the earth that has the potential to rival America's power is Eurasia as a collective, from Russia to China and all that's in between, including the Middle East countries, Iran, Iraq, and so forth. And that encompasses much of Western Europe, certainly the Balkans, however you want to define. And that region contains the population base, the skilled manpower base, the scientific base, the technological base, the raw materials to create unlimited prosperity for as far as the eye can see for 2/3 of the world's population, and independent of the United States. That is the prime conflict in today's world, that the United States and the establishment of the United States is not willing to let that happen freely.
Mr. Engel, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you for having me.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world, please?